Welcome to this Q&A video. I know some of you are waiting for a deep dive video on vaccines and myocarditis. Time has not allowed for research on that yet, all in due course. But I also invited questions for Q&A and questions we have, so let's get into those. Hi Mallen, do you believe it to be a negative thing that many people's political voting decisions are made almost entirely on social issues as opposed to economic/governance issues? For example, I vote for the Australian Labor Party, centre-left, due to their consideration of workers' interests and general competency in government policy and conduct. This is despite the fact that I probably identify as a social conservative relative to the progressive constituency that the left has acquired in recent years. Not that I have anything against social progressives, but I don't think that your socio-cultural beliefs, conservative or progressive, should be used to determine who the government is. What do you think? Thanks, Mallen. It is very easy to express despondency about how people vote and why. I mean, for example, one of my family members when I was a teenager talked about how she voted the way she did in the recent election because she thought the Labour leader had shifty eyes. Now, most of us manage a little bit better than that at election time. The truth is that how people vote rarely aligns with a number of things that may turn out to be pretty important. Any long-term view, especially if it involves short-term pain for long-term gain, pretty much out of the equation. Ultimately, it comes down mostly to three things. For broadly non-party political people, a mixture of whose programme you believe will be the best interest to you and your family, plus, if you're lucky, whether the proposed parties seem actually competent or not. For more politically engaged people, it may be whichever issues are biggest in their mind at the time that the election takes place. Now, is that a great system? No, it's a terrible system, made defensible only by the standard trope that it's better than all of the others. Somehow, with all of the imperfections in information, the gaps in understanding, the self-interest, the political lies, the tricks of the trade, by and large, electorates make decent decisions more often than they get it completely wrong. And the fact that when they do get it wrong, there'll be another chance along in 4 or 5 years' time, provides some degree of self-correction. The challenge tends to be when you have a total paucity of quality choices. The British electorate, when faced with a competent party and a potential Prime Minister and an incompetent one, will generally find their way through some rationale to voting for the competent one. No evidence that socio-cultural beliefs affect that judgment very much. They do get confused if there are two competent ones, not a regular occurrence, and even more anxious if it seems to be two incompetent or barely competent ones. The problem then isn't so much what grounds people vote on, but why the political system is broken enough to put such candidates up as the choice for them to vote between in the first place. And the answer to that, as we've seen in America, is where the ideology of the activists blind them to the importance of candidate quality above and beyond ideological conformity. As for the choice you face in Australia and how you describe how you make that choice, well, you take the factors where you think the least bad combination will result. The fact you also specifically included competency in government as one of your criteria seems to me to underline the point. I think that smart floating voters will always be looking for competence matched to a party that is within sight of the centre ground. If and only if you have the luxury of 2 or more competent choices, should you resort to indulging your policy preferences as your primary decision factor. Should we all be satisfied with Cardinal Pell's doctors? He had many enemies in Australia of questionable justification and very powerful ones in Rome regarding corruption he exposed. I wonder if and where his death lies in the eternal spectrum between professional negligence and first-degree murder. I'm always amazed about the places people see lurking shadows and dastardly schemes in this modern age of ours. Cardinal Pell was 81 years old. I mean, I don't think you have to resort to theories of lurking enemies to explain the story. 81-year-old man dies. Mind you, since he died of cardiac arrest, I am surprised I haven't yet heard people suggesting it was because of the vaccine. Even though it immediately followed a hip surgery, such detail as that won't stop the true believers. I mean, that website I referred to when I did the video on the claims of young athletes dying because of vaccines. I noticed the other day they've been adding new names, as they seem to be doing every day. One of them was the well-known young athlete Pele, who at age 81 died of colon cancer. Now, sure, Cardinal Pell was no athlete, but then Pele was no spring chicken. Anyway, I digress. So look, I don't know enough about Pell to understand if he uncovered corruption and had enemies, or if he was someone who had covered up child abuse in the church, or maybe even both. But the absence of suspicious circumstances here, I think I would need more than speculation to presume there was anything whatsoever to see. Now, okay, maybe that will turn out to be terribly complacent, but the truth is that every single public figure who dies, you can, within a minute or two at most, come up with some explanation of why maybe there's more to it that meets the eye. The fact human beings have the creativity to do that is a feature of our species. The fact that right now somebody will do it literally every time somebody dies is apparently a feature of our age. It's not something I would invest a lot of time into, short of actual evidence that something is amiss. What sources do you use for the Ukraine war casualty estimates for both sides? And how do you come up with your own likely guess? And there's another flavour of this in the comments as well. Mallen, is there any chance that on your next news roundup you can give us information of equal worth on the losses and state of the Ukrainian armed forces? I watched A Year from Space on TV this week, and it looks like Ukraine is getting flattened, according to the satellite imagery. Of course, you can't tell the state of the armed forces from satellite imagery. You can see the impact on buildings that have been the focus of heavy shelling. I wouldn't have thought any of what you see would be a surprise to anyone considering the news. But on the main point, I do not give overall figures for either side in the conflict, and I'm puzzled by the question, how do you come up with your own likely guess? Because I've never given a guess, likely or otherwise. Largely on account of the fact that such figures are just not available. People who ask similar questions in the comments, and I can't speak for the questioner in this instance, are often those whose contributions generally seem motivated by wanting to confirm their prior preference that their side should be shown to be winning. Well, that's not the mission I undertake in the news roundups. If we get some solid indications that momentum is going in one direction or the other in a substantial way in a particular place, of course we'll talk about that and what the implications might be. But this is not a campaigning channel, and I'm not going to propagandise for either side. If your reaction when you see an absence of propaganda for your own side is to treat it as de facto clear propaganda for the other side, that is your problem, not mine. There are some occasions when, for instance, a particularly heavy casualty rate in a specific location or time becomes part of the story, and the fact of that is verified or at least supported by multiple sources. So, for instance, the fact that newly mobilised Russian soldiers have been getting sent into battle zones without the correct training, people trained with artillery being sent in as infantry, for instance, and without decent equipment or sufficient ammunition, and that consequently those unfortunate individuals have been suffering high levels of attrition. All of that is attested to in general on both sides. The Russian pro-war milli bloggers are outraged at it and calling for the Ministry of Defence to be held accountable, and the eyewitness reports of the Ukrainian soldiers on the other side attest to it. Mentioning that can be relevant when it becomes such a feature that it's part of a dynamic of how this continues to unfold in Russia politically. But do I ever say that such casualties mean that Ukraine is winning? I certainly do not, because there are many, many factors involved in such an equation, mostly for information that we don't have. All the evidence of the moment is that de facto we have stalemate overall, with the hope from the Russian side that more troops through mobilisation, as well as a long time frame to erode Ukraine's foreign support, that will shift the balance in their favour. And from the Ukrainian side, that more advanced Western weaponry will tip the balance on a shorter time scale in their favour. I note the different strategies, the fact that either of them could play out. Generally, I review information sources that are as objective as I can find on this. So the Institute for the Study of War produces a daily summary. It is extensively referenced, drawing on news sources, but also Russian milli-bloggers, on-the-ground social media evidence, satellite imagery, and the like. And it distinguishes between what the different voices are claiming and that which can be verified by documentary evidence. But this YouTube channel does news summaries with discussion of implications and big themes. I do not do the minutiae of calculating which side has lost what quantity of which equipment, which side moved 100 metres forward today in one place while retreating 50 metres backwards in another place. There are other channels that do that much better than I ever could. That said, I will give the pro-Russia commentators one point. The US, the UK, the EU ministries who produce estimates of Russian forces and equipment and the losses they may have sustained, they avoid speaking about their estimates of the Ukrainian side because they don't want to be the vehicle for providing useful intelligence to Russia. So it's true that in the general mainstream news coverage, there's more talk, even if some of it's pure speculation, about the Russian side and a lot more silence about Ukraine. That can make it tricky for an independent who doesn't have reporters on the ground, to spot looming shortfalls should they exist. As far as I can tell, though, the pro-Russia YouTube channels that my commenters tend to praise, they haven't had a great track record over the last 6 months or so of providing an accurate view of Ukraine's strengths or weaknesses. I have heard a number of predictions from them of imminent Ukrainian collapse, which, I don't know if you noticed, hasn't happened yet. So I would seek out more objective sources if you really want to know what's going on, rather than simply seeking someone who will fill the vacuum of information with whatever it is you want to hear. Will Rishi Sunak last longer than Theresa May? Almost certainly not. Theresa May was Prime Minister for 3 years. If Sunak fends off any attempts in the short term to replace him with Boris Johnson, then he will take the party into the general election in 2024, and he will almost certainly lose that election, unless Keir Starmer's Labour Party self-destructs in some dramatic way, which can never be ruled out entirely. And if he loses the election, he will be replaced as party leader. He just doesn't have the support amongst the party membership to sustain him as leader in the face of electoral defeat. The only way for him to last longer than that will be if he does such an amazing job in the next year that he completely turns around how the country views the political realities of the moment. It's unlikely his party will let him do that, even if he was capable of it, which I rather doubt that he is. They are just exhausted by power. They've lost all self-discipline, a fact testified to by the fact that there are some seriously talking about bringing Boris Johnson back on the grounds that they think he's an election winner, as though the public will be applauding if the party defenestrates a third Prime Minister in quick succession, making the country a laughing stock all over again. Honestly, the scale of delusion in Westminster sometimes is just breathtaking. On the plus side for Sunak, at least, unlike Liz Truss, he outlasted the lettuce. I was reading recently about the 1989 Hillsborough disaster, in which nearly 100 people were crushed to death. On that day, and for more than a quarter century later, police, media and government all blamed the disaster on football hooligans from Liverpool. Not until 2016 did the UK government acknowledge that it was actually a lack of preparedness and poor decision-making by the local authorities that resulted in a catastrophic crowd control failure. It was the police who were to blame for failing to meet their duty of care to people. Are there lessons to learn from this with regards to the 6th of January? Now, to be fair, it was widely acknowledged by rather more people and institutions a lot earlier than that. The original Taylor report showing that the failure was of crowd control by the South Yorkshire Police came in 1990, which was the very next year. What took until 2016 was the acceptance that this meant that those who died had been unlawfully killed rather than accidentally died. A distinction that was obviously important for the grieving families and for basic accountability. But as for your question about comparisons with January the 6th, I don't think that's helpful. They were such different types of events. People attending a football game, people protesting outside the nation's Capitol building. I think there's a lot of ways to criticise the mainstream take on January the 6th, but I just wouldn't look to Hillsborough to do so. Because specifically, if you're at the Capitol building to protest and you choose to enter the building knowing that you shouldn't, you have to take agency for that choice. We believe in personal responsibility, don't we? At no point did the police shepherd the crowd to go into the building, thereby creating consequences for hapless, innocent citizens. You can blame them for a number of things, but not that. What helps keep you from being cynical and jaded at the corruption that seems to cause so many problems? Well, look, human society has always had the best and worst of humanity. The worst things that are done today are rarely a pale shadow of some of the horrors that have been done throughout history. And throughout all of those times, people fought against darkness, tried to make things better. Sometimes they failed, but the trend of history was broadly that things got better over time, and the human spirit doesn't give up trying. It's a hard lesson to remember if you are personally actually stuck in a place that's in dark times at a particular moment in time, but it's a piece of perspective that's worth holding on to. And besides, I think I live in a country that on the objective scale of how societies function across the world is one of the least corrupt ones. So does that mean that one should smile benignly on the corruption that does happen? Of course not, but the majority of citizens and a good proportion of politicians would agree. And that means the battle's already being fought on multiple fronts. People with optimism that the world can be changed tend to be the ones who change the world. So whether you do the glass half full thing or not, it's entirely a choice that we make for ourselves. The glass is never empty. It never has been through history. It's never full. It's never empty. What you make of that, always up to you. Do you have any examples of really positive news stories or projects that are actively and effectively addressing the problems of climate change? Well, there's a lot of people innovating to solve problems. Many of them fly under the radar because the problems and their solutions are just not that interesting. I mean, I mentioned on this channel before, for instance, about shipping company Maersk prototyping zero-emissions shipping vessels. Progress is being made, but it takes time. There are little technology breakthroughs, but I won't big those up until it's clear they can be pushed to scale, because there's always barriers to be overcome, and they get overcome one at a time. And this is the point. I don't think this problem gets solved by sudden and dramatic breakthroughs. There may be one or two impressive things that emerge, but mostly it will be 1,000 baby steps being taken across multiple areas every single day. Boring for headline writers, bit by bit we'll just gradually inch our way towards the target. All the while the attention goes to the grandstanding activists and the politicians making big but mostly rather empty gestures. On the knowledge side, the fact that recent research suggests now that once the emissions stop, then warming will stop fairly quickly as a consequence, as opposed to the catastrophists who insist that another 2 degrees warming is already baked in. That is genuinely good news, because it makes a difference to the scale of the task at hand. There will be turbulence to come, but I think we'll get there, even though there will be some consequences that will be harder on us as a society than the complacent folks would like to think. Do you believe Mr. Jeremy Corbyn would have been as bad a leader of the UK as the right would have us believe? And do you think Mr. Keir Starmer, is dynamic enough to drag us out of the funk after leaving Europe? Yes, I always think that highly ideological leaders of left or right are the least good potential leaders of the UK. Ideologues are more likely to be blind to realities that are inconvenient to their beliefs. They rarely have actual good leadership skills precisely because of that. Corbyn had poor leadership skills, and the truth of it is he stood for leader without the least idea that he was actually going to be successful. In every such Labour contest, there was always one candidate from the left extreme of the party. They were put up as the no-hope candidate who pleased the base by going down to glorious defeat. Had the left realised the zeitgeist was about to have a moment that was going to allow such an aberrant breakthrough moment, Corbyn is probably not the one they would have put up. But it was his turn. Nobody was more surprised than him when it turned out that he was successful. Because he was successful, because the party membership was fed up of the establishment candidates, the lack of any inspiration in the lot of them. It wasn't because they were responding to Corbyn's charisma or his innovative programmes or anything like that. It really was just a case of the right place at the right time. Now, of course, the right built on that to demonise him, and a lot of that was unfair. My impression of Corbyn is that he was basically a decent guy who had convictions and lived mostly in accord with them. So, for instance, when half of the Palace of Westminster was disgraced with their expenses scandals, Corbyn was one of the few who came out completely smelling of roses, because he claimed very few expenses, didn't maintain a London property at the taxpayer's expense. Whatever else he wasn't a politician on the make. As a backbencher, he would have finished his time in Parliament, having cared passionately about certain causes, spoken up, sometimes to good effect, sometimes not. He would have been sort of respected, as a number of the left-wing issue campaigners ended up being at the end of their careers. Never before then, but at the end. But he was unlucky enough to be thrust into the spotlight when it wasn't where he was ever going to thrive. As for your second question about Keir Starmer, the jury's out. Right now, you would say that he lacks the dynamism, but he has grown in stature over the last year. It is possible that if the polls continue to make it clear that Labour's the government in waiting, then, people do sometimes rise to that situation. And unlike Corbyn, he has some of the basic leadership skills to build on. Now, he's not a Tony Blair, but then, at least he's not a Gordon Brown either. He'll have a tough job on his hand if he's elected, but he will have the advantage that the country will give him a proper honeymoon period because he will be genuinely new. And the newly dethroned opposition will probably break apart and go a bit mad for a couple of years, minimum. Mind you, a lot of that is dependent on winning a majority. If he falls short of that, it's going to be a horrible mess. And to be fair, it'll be the same if the Conservatives are left with the largest minority. The next government, whoever it is, needs to have that working majority. Labour needs to push its emerging stature firmly against the slightly declining allure of the Scottish nationalists to start winning back Scottish seats. I mean, they could do with 4 years rather than 1.5 to do that. 1.5 is all they've got. The UK is just more vulnerable to minority governments than most, precisely because the SNP is the largest third party, and their price for coalition would be the breakup of the union, and that rules them out as partners for either of the two main parties. So you have a country ungovernable by anyone unless they get an actual majority. The time to spread and infect Chinese citizens far exceeds the suggested story the current epidemic event started after zero COVID was dropped, yet the story remains in place. With so many other stories we dismiss as lies from China and Russia, why is this story so solidly believed by media? If we assume this virus is 100% contagious, just how short would the incubation and transmission periods need to be to reach the numbers China has now seen? Well, I'm not sure that's true per se. China was clearly losing the fight against COVID inch by inch before the abandonment of zero COVID, which was exactly why the citizens started to rebel, because they were being pushed into severe lockdowns increasingly often. All of that was reported, albeit without figures. Of course, China doesn't release the figures, so we didn't know exactly how many they were seeing above and beyond what they were reporting. I wouldn't be surprised if the leadership decided to end zero COVID as much because they realised that the jig was up, that Omicron had escaped them anyway, than because of the protests. What's happening now is exactly what we would expect to happen, with the highly infectious Omicron variant being let rip in a large, socially minded population with a lower level of vaccination and little prior natural immunity. Remember, that didn't happen to us. We were hit by the original, less transmissible Alpha variant. By the time Omicron reached us and created a rapid wave when it did, we had a lot of vaccination and prior infection in the community. So fast as it was in places like the UK and Europe and the US, we would expect it to be faster in China, as it was at the end of 2021 in Hong Kong, for the same reason. By the way, by all accounts, we're about to enjoy yet another even more transmissible variant, the Kraken. It seems the Kraken was eventually, after all, released, just not in the way Trump's lawyers meant. Early reports don't suggest it's any more dangerous than previous variants, and it's remarkable how little airtime is being taken up by it. Probably because nobody's using psychological tricks to get everyone scared this time, because governments nearly bankrupted their countries the last time, and they realise, well, maybe we're just going to have to live with it. Arguably, the mindset we should have had from the minute all the high-risk people had been given the opportunity to get vaccinated. But there you go. What do you think of the direction Jordan Peterson is going? I used to be a fan, especially of his life advice stuff, but now I've come to see him as a right-wing nut job. Any thoughts? I likewise used to be a fan. He had a lot of thoughtful things to say, and from his knowledge of the literature of his own field, he often had powerful observations to make, both in, as you say, advice to people trying to find their way in a changing world, but also in opposition to some of the genuine instances of woke nonsense. Since he recovered from the terrible illness that he suffered a couple of years ago, he has indulged that thoughtful side less and has been focused in on the partisan polemic more. And that tends to take him to areas outside his expertise, where he defaults to the populist right talking points, which is a terrible shame. But solid evidence of what we've noted several times here, such rabbit holes are just as attractive to the highly intelligent as they are to anyone. Can he recover from this? I don't know whether his mental health struggles are a factor in it, or if he's just following the audience capture dynamics that social media introduces, because he does have a substantial and appreciative audience for his current tone. He's getting lots of affirmation for this content. The appreciation used to be that, he could sit down with someone like Sam Harris and they could explore their disagreements in a thoughtful and open way, and people would say, how refreshing a discussion. Now it's a baser audience hunger that he's feeding, delighting in dismissive, insulting epithets thrown at the other side. If he were to pull back and restore some of his old intellectual vigour, few would be better pleased than me. I'm not aware of many times when that's been the outcome of this sort of story. Let's hope I'm wrong about that. What are the main scientific objections to Dr. Richard Linson's assertion that climate change should not be a concern for the next 5,000 years? I put this one in purely as an example of how not to ask a question. You give an unreferenced claim with a name attached. What am I supposed to do with that? Stop what I'm doing and start looking around, hoping that I might chance upon the source of whatever it is that prompted you to ask the question? Read Linson's entire body of work, trying to find the bit that you're referring to? Because there's no claim in your question, just a professed conclusion. The question isn't, what are the scientific objections to a claim that isn't even described? It's what claim is being made, what evidence supports it. You can then ask if there's additional evidence that refutes it. Rather than giving me the name of a commenter you like and expecting me therefore to know what you're talking about, give me the claim, give me the evidence that supports it. Then I'd have all the information in the question I'd need to give you an answer. In the absence of that, the IPCC report suggests that it's a problem we need to be tackling short term. There you go. If you want a more specific answer, then you need to ask me a more specific question. Now look, people might be wondering why I even bother answering in this case. I'm doing it because I get so many questions framed in this way. What do you think about what so-and-so says about water not being wet? I don't know. Why should I take it remotely seriously? What claim are they making that leads to the conclusion you're quoting? And preferably what evidence supports it. But failing that, at least a reference to where they make the claim so I can go straight to it and I can see what evidence they do or don't give. So no, not for this question nor for any other am I rushing off to research details that would have taken you seconds to provide in the question. The reason for that is I'm trying to get all of us moving away from supporting personalities towards looking at claims and evidence, since I doubt that any of us are right or wrong about everything. Focus on the claims, not on the people making them. If you give me a claim by Tony Heller, someone who in my experience is wrong a higher percentage of the time than almost anyone else that I ever watch, I will still say, what is the claim? Let's have a look at the evidence, because it may be correct. Nobody is wrong all the time. Nobody's right all the time. All right, rant mode over. Thanks for all the questions. See you for the news roundup on Friday. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.